This is DW News live from Berlin. U.S. President Joe Biden flies to Europe today for an emergency NATO leaders summit on Ukraine on Thursday. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg will outline the summit agenda shortly. We will bring you live coverage. I'm Sumi Somaskanda. It's good to have you with us. NATO leaders will meet for an emergency summit on Ukraine. U.S. President Joe Biden is due to join other heads of NATO member states in Brussels on Thursday. The alliance is balancing more military help for Ukraine to fight the Russian invasion while avoiding a direct confrontation with Moscow. The alliance has stationed more soldiers and weapons in Eastern European member states. And Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg has assured NATO states that the alliance will come to their aid if the war spills over into neighboring countries. Stoltenberg is expected to stress unity as the alliance deals with a more aggressive Russia. And let's go right to our correspondent, Terry Schultz, at NATO headquarters in Brussels as we're waiting for that pre-summit press conference with Jens Stoltenberg to begin. Hi, Terry. It's good to see you. What are you expecting Jens Stoltenberg to outline at this press conference?
Sumi, the main job of NATO now and always is to project unity, to show that European allies and the United States are completely on the same page when it comes to trying to deter Moscow from letting this conflict spill over into a NATO country. That doesn't give a lot of reassurance to Ukraine, but that's not what NATO is here for. And that's what we'll hear again from Jens Stoltenberg today. That's why President Biden is coming here. He's going to be speaking to his European allies about strengthening sanctions against Moscow, which of course is done on the European Union side of town. We may also hear Biden commit to putting U.S. forces in Europe on a more permanent basis. This is something that last week defense ministers tasked military planners with looking at, and it's something that they feel may well be necessary if Russia is going to continue to create instability just over NATO's borders.
We should mention that Joe Biden is also attending. It's going to be a busy day for him tomorrow. He's also attending the EU Leaders Summit and the G7 meeting, Terry. But has NATO shifted its position, and do you think there's any chance that NATO could shift its position on its rejecting of a no-fly zone?
No, I don't hear any sign that that NATO would even consider this. What NATO believes is that this would not help the Ukrainians and that it could create a direct conflict with Russia. You set up a no-fly zone. Not only are Ukrainian planes grounded, but once a Russian plane would fly into this zone, NATO would be forced to react. And of course, the Kremlin has of course re-emphasized as well that this would create a direct conflict. So this is not something that NATO is considering at this time. And we don't even hear individual allies sounding willing to set up even a limited no-fly zone for humanitarian corridors, for example.
That's right, Terry. We did hear the German chancellor underline that point in his speech in the Bundestag today. We also heard about a Polish proposal for peacekeepers in Poland, and the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, was not very happy about that. Tell us more about this.
Well, this is something that Poland has said it will propose at this summit, peacekeepers in Ukraine. The immediate reaction from officials here at NATO is, what peace is there to keep? And again, both NATO and Moscow say this could lead to a direct conflict. I believe the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that again this morning. But you have to have a peace to keep. And at this moment, of course, we don't see that anywhere in Ukraine. This, again, is one of those proposals that is made in good faith, but is very unlikely to be considered by NATO.
And Terry, we mentioned that the German chancellor was speaking to lawmakers earlier, and he said in his speech that he believes that Russia's invasion has stalled. What is NATO's view on that?
NATO hasn't given a specific assessment on this, but of course we do speak to people behind the scenes, and no one is quite sure at this point because it's very hard to know, of course, what the Kremlin has in mind, whether it is a stalemate, whether the two sides have truly blockaded each other, or whether Russia is regrouping. Of course, it could bring in more troops, it could bring in more equipment, and it's unclear at this moment. But what NATO is going to say is that whatever is happening on the ground in Ukraine Ukraine, its job is to reinforce its own territory. And so we may see allies commit to sending more reinforcements to the Eastern Front. They have already done a lot, sent a new battalion to Romania, for example, also new forces to Slovakia. So we may well hear more of these kind of commitments, but we are not going to hear anything about committing forces inside Ukraine.
Okay, well, certainly a lot on the agenda there for NATO. Terry, we're going to come back to you once we see that press conference up and running, and we'll get your take after the press conference as well. Thank you, Terry.
Sure.
Ukraine is calling on Russia to allow civilians to escape the southern port of Mariupol. The local council says Russian forces who have surrounded the city have reduced it to ashes with constant bombing. President Volodymyr Zelensky says 100,000 civilians are trapped without food, water, or medication. Zelensky says Russian forces seized a humanitarian convoy attempting to bring relief to Mariupol's besieged residents.
Bombs keep falling on Mariupol. The besieged city is under relentless shelling by Russian forces. Satellite pictures show the extent of the devastation. Apartment buildings burnt out. A metal factory shelled. Hundreds of thousands of people are still stuck here under the falling bombs.
At the moment, there are around 100,000 people living in Mariupol under inhumane conditions, under a complete siege, without food, water and medicine, under constant shelling and bombardment. For several weeks, we have been trying to organize stable humanitarian corridors for Mariupol's residents, and almost all our attempts have been, unfortunately, obstructed by shelling or deliberate terror by Russian occupiers.
Those who were able to flee Mariupol say conditions there are desperate.
The people of Mariupol aren't being heard. They're in need of help. People don't have water. They drink water.
Are we just jumping in here because that press conference with Jens Stoltenberg is starting? Let's listen in.
At the pivotal moment for our security. And I look forward to welcoming President Zelensky, who will address us during the meeting. President Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine is causing death and destruction every day. Allies stand united in support for the brave people of Ukraine and against the Kremlin's cruelty. Putin must end this war, allow aid and safe passage of civilians, and engage in real diplomacy. NATO allies have responded to this crisis with strong support for Ukraine and unprecedented costs for Russia. NATO has acted with speed and unity to protect and defend all allies. There are now hundreds of thousands of allied troops at heightened readiness across the alliance. 100,000 US troops in Europe and 40,000 forces under direct NATO command, mostly in the eastern part of the alliance. All backed by major air and naval power, including with 5 carrier strike groups in the high north and in the Mediterranean. At the summit tomorrow, we will make further decisions. I expect leaders will agree to strengthen NATO's posture in all domains, with major increases to our forces in the eastern part of the alliance, on land, in the air, and at sea. The first step is the deployment of 4 new NATO battle groups in Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia. Along with our existing forces in the Baltic countries and Poland, this means that we will have 8 multinational NATO battle groups all along the eastern flank, from the Baltic to the Black Sea. We face a new reality for our security. So we must reset our deterrence and defense for the longer term. Tomorrow, NATO leaders will reaffirm our support to Ukraine. Ukraine has the right to self-defense under the UN Charter. And we are helping Ukrainians to uphold this fundamental right. Since 2014, allies have trained Ukraine's armed forces and significantly strengthened their capabilities. They are putting that training into practice now on the front lines with great bravery. In the last months, allies have stepped up military support, providing anti-tank and air defense systems, drones, fuel and ammunition, as well as financial aid and hosting millions of refugees. Tomorrow, I expect allies will agree to provide additional support, including cybersecurity assistance, as well as equipment to help Ukraine protect against chemical, biological, and radiological and nuclear threats. President Putin's invasion is brutal, and the human suffering is horrifying and painful to witness. We are determined to do all we can to support Ukraine. But we have a responsibility to ensure that the war does not escalate beyond Ukraine and become a conflict between NATO and Russia. This would cause even more death and even more destruction. I also expect we will agree to step up tailored support for other partners at risk from Russian pressure, including Georgia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. Working together with the European Union, we must help them to uphold their sovereignty and the right to make independent decisions. We face a fundamentally changed security environment where authoritarian powers are increasingly prepared to use force to get their way. So I expect we will also address the role of China in this crisis. Beijing has joined Moscow in questioning the right of independent nations to choose their own path. China has provided Russia with political support, including by spreading blatant lies and disinformation. And allies are concerned that China could provide material support for the Russian invasion. I expect leaders will call on China to live up to its responsibilities as a member of the UN Security Council, refrain from supporting Russia's war effort, and join the rest of the world in calling for an immediate, peaceful end to this war. We will also call on Belarus to end its complicity in Putin's invasion. The decisions we take tomorrow will have far-reaching implications. Major reinforcements to our security will require major investments in defense. So I expect allies will agree to redouble their efforts to invest more. There is a new sense of urgency because we cannot take peace for granted. From the start of this crisis, Europe and North America have stood together, united in NATO, and we remain united, opposing Russia's aggression, supporting Ukraine, and protecting all allies. And with that, I'm ready to take your questions.
Okay, we'll start with CNN, lady over there.
Thank you, Natasha Bertram with CNN.
Mr. Secretary-General, Estonia has been calling for NATO to build up a permanent force in the region that is capable of stopping a Russian offensive, but the NATO-Russia Founding Act technically does not allow the alliance to establish permanent military basing in so-called new member states. And so I'm wondering if you believe that it's time to repeal the NATO-Russia Founding Act, given its invasion of Ukraine. And I'm also wondering, Estonia's defense chief had also said that NATO should get involved directly if Russia uses weapons of mass destruction, like chemical weapons. And I'm wondering if these kinds of red lines and how NATO would react if they were crossed are going to be discussed.
First of all, we have to remember that we, over the last weeks, have deployed a substantial number of combat-ready troops to the eastern part of the alliance. Unprecedented NATO presence in the Baltic region, including in Estonia. And I've been in Estonia myself, and I've seen the NATO troops there. We have actually doubled the size of the NATO battle group, and we have doubled the number of battle groups in the eastern part of the alliance. So not only doubled the size, but also doubled the number of battle groups. Close to 40,000 troops under direct NATO command, and then on top of that, increased presence by the United States and others on, within the bilateral arrangements. So in totality, this is a significant reinforcement of our presence in the east, including in Estonia, with air, sea and land forces. And we are ready and we are there to protect and defend allies. We are ready to respond massively to any potential threat attack against any NATO allied country. This has already happened. So this reinforcement has already taken place. And we will then also tomorrow make decisions and declare that we have deployed 4 more battle groups to Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria and Romania. Then there is a need to also address the more long-term consequences. So in addition to what we have already done, I expect also Allied leaders tomorrow to agree a tasking to our military commanders to look into the more longer-term consequences for our deterrence and defense. There is a need to reset our deterrence and defense, and I expect that to be a substantial increase of our presence for the long term, and we will do what is necessary to ensure that we protect and defend all allies and ensure that NATO provides credible deterrence and defense to all countries, including Estonia. Russia has walked away from the NATO-Russia Founding Act. They have violated it again and again. They violated it clearly back in 2014 when they illegally annexed Crimea and started to destabilize eastern Ukraine. And they have violated it when they moved into Georgia in 2008. And of course, the invasion of Ukraine now is a blatant violation of the NATO-Russia Founding Act. On chemical weapons, first of all, any use of chemical weapons would totally change the nature of the conflict. And it will be a blatant violation of international law and will have far-reaching consequences. And I think that's the most important message to convey, that any use of chemical weapons is absolutely unacceptable and will have far-reaching consequences.
We'll go to NBC, lady in red in the middle. Yeah.
Andrea Mitchell, NBC News. Secretary General, President Biden, in leaving Washington, just said that he believes that the use of chemical weapons by Russia in Ukraine is a real threat. You have just said that we cannot take peace for granted, and there is no sign, certainly, that Vladimir Putin is taking diplomacy seriously. And here you have President Zelensky, who will plead again with NATO for admission to NATO. If chemical weapons are used in Ukraine, how would it be morally acceptable for NATO to ignore President Zelensky's plea for NATO admission?
For NATO?
For NATO admission. To ignore his plea to be admitted to NATO? Thank you, sir.
What we see in Ukraine now is really painful. It's horrific, and we see the brutal consequences of a full-fledged invasion of a peaceful, independent, sovereign nation. And that's also the reason why NATO allies have stepped up support, including with advanced air defense systems, anti-tank systems, different types of weapons, ammunition, and we are providing unprecedented support to Ukraine. And this is actually also comes on top of what we have done for many years, because NATO allies have trained tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops since 2014. And they are now on the front line fighting the invading forces. And it is first and foremost the courage of the Ukrainian forces and the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian leadership that has enabled them to resist and to fight back against the Russian invasion. But at the same time, the support they have received for many years has proven extremely important and critical. And I expect that when Allied leaders meet tomorrow, they will address how to further strengthen our support to Ukraine. NATO membership is not on the agenda, but support to Ukraine is absolutely on top of our agenda and will be one of the main issues to be addressed tomorrow.
Okay, Sky.
Thank you. Secretary General, thank you very much. Mark Stone from Sky News. Could you explain, or could you outline how NATO defends itself against a nuclear attack? Because it's clear that on Russian state media, they are openly, propagandists, pundits, people close to the Kremlin are now talking in pretty straight and stark terms about a nuclear attack. How does NATO defend itself against a nuclear attack? Thank you.
Russia must stop its nuclear saber rattling. This is dangerous and it is irresponsible. NATO is there to protect and defend all allies, and we convey a very clear message to Russia that the nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. And it just highlights the importance of ending the war in Ukraine, because we need to do everything we can to prevent the war from escalating beyond Ukraine and becoming even more deadly and even more dangerous than what we see today. Any use of nuclear weapons will fundamentally change the nature of the conflict, and Russia must understand that a nuclear war should never be fought and they can never win a nuclear war. This is actually something that Russia has agreed to again and again, and the continued nuclear saber rattling from Russia, the nuclear rhetoric, is actually contradicting what they have stated in the UN and in other formats, agreeing that we should do whatever we can to prevent a nuclear conflict.
Okay. Al Jazeera.
Secretary General, staying with weapons of mass destruction, you said in your opening statement on chemical and biological weapons that you were thinking of equipment to protect Ukraine. Can you give us more details of what you're going to be proposing to the leaders tomorrow?
So we have provided different types of support, also when it comes to different measures to protect against chemical weapons. And I expect the allies to look into how they can step up and provide more equipment to protect and defend against chemical weapons. I don't think it's useful if I go into all the details, partly because allies will discuss this tomorrow, but also partly because I think that when it comes to the details about exactly what kind of support we provide, it's actually not always the best thing to be too detailed about that. We provide support, we are stepping up our support, and we are concerned about the possibility of use of chemical weapons or biological weapons. We've also seen not only the nuclear rhetoric from the Russian side, but also these false claims that Ukraine, supported by NATO allies, are producing and preparing for the use of chemical weapons. This is an absolute false accusation, but it may be a way for them to, in a way, try to create a pretext for their use of chemical weapons. Russia has used chemical agents before against their own opposition and also on NATO allied territory in Salisbury. And Russia was, of course, part of the use of chemical weapons in Syria. They facilitated and supported the Assad regime, which has actually used chemical weapons several times. So we are concerned, and that's also the reason why we are ready and will address tomorrow ways to provide support to Ukraine to protect themselves against the use of chemical weapons. And let me add that, of course, this is extremely serious for the people of Ukraine. But any use of chemical weapons or biological weapons may also have direct consequences for NATO allied countries, people living there. The contamination, the spread of chemical or biological agents used in Ukraine may have direct consequences also for the population living in NATO allied countries in Europe. So it just underscores the seriousness of our concerns.
Okay, we'll go to Interfax Ukraine. The lady in red with glasses in the middle. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Irina Sommer, news agency Interfax Ukraine. Secretary General, according to NATO and US officials, Belarus is ready to send their troops into the war against Ukraine. What it will change for Ukrainians and what it will change for NATO? And my second question is about coalition. Mass media already reported that Poland leadership are ready to put tomorrow for discussion a proposal to send a peacekeeping mission to Ukraine. They mentioned NATO peacekeeping mission to Ukraine. But how about coalition? Coming back to 2003, a coalition were created from 3 NATO allies and 1 non-NATO country in Iraq. Do you think it will be a good solution to create a coalition of countries who wants to fight for Ukraine without NATO involvement? Thank you.
So first of Belarus. Belarus has been complicit to this invasion from the start, actually before the start, because Belarus allowed its territory to be used as a ground for mobilizing, massing troops that invaded Ukraine. And Belarus continues to enable the invasion by providing the territory, airfields, military infrastructure, bases, but also by allowing Russia to use Belarusian airspace to launch attacks every night, every day against Ukrainian cities, against Ukrainian civilians, against the Ukrainian nation. So Belarus is already heavily involved in the way that it has been complicit and has supported the Russian invasion. And of course we call on Belarus to stop doing exactly that and not be used by Russia to conduct this brutal war against a neighbor, Ukraine. When it comes to forces, so NATO is not part of the conflict. We provide support to Ukraine, but we're not part of the conflict. We help Ukraine with upholding their right for self-defense, which is enshrined in the UN Charter. But NATO will not send troops into Ukraine. We have to understand that it is extremely important to provide support to Ukraine, and we are stepping up. But at the same time, it is also extremely important to prevent that this conflict becomes a full-fledged war between NATO and Russia. And therefore, it has been a very clear message from NATO allies that we will not send troops to Ukraine.
We have a Polish radio, lady at the back. Oops.
Thank you very much, Anna. Beata Pomecka, Polskie Radio, Polish public broadcaster. Secretary General, if I may ask about enhancing the forward presence on the eastern flank, is it a time to consider or to decide to enlarge the battalions that are in Baltic states and Poland into the brigade groups, and also follow up to the question concerning nuclear threats repeated again and again by Russia? Is there a possibility for the leaders to prepare a kind of a plan just in case? Thank you very much.
First, on the nuclear threat, NATO has plans in place to protect all allies against any threat. But our main message is that Russia should stop this dangerous, irresponsible nuclear rhetoric. But let there be no doubt about our readiness to protect and defend allies against any threat, any attack. And of course, we have plans in place to do exactly that. On the size, well, first of all, so before this invasion, we had 4 battle groups, battalion-sized. Now we have doubled the size of those battle groups in Poland, in Lithuania, in Estonia, and in Latvia. And then we have doubled the number of battle groups with the new battle groups in Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania, which the leaders will then announce tomorrow. And there are more. In Poland, there are also additional troops from the US. I recently visited the Vask Air Base. I met with US and other pilots. So there has been a significant increase of NATO allies, especially the United States, presence in the eastern part of the alliance. This is our immediate response, has already taken place. Then I think we need to separate that a bit from the more longer-term adaptation of our alliance. And we will spend some time now, from now until the summit in June, to make more fundamental decisions on our deterrence and defense. It's about resetting our deterrence and defense, especially in the East. And there I expect that a part of that will be a significant increase of our presence on the ground in the eastern part of the alliance for the long term. So immediately we have done a lot. Then we will start the process of more long-term changes in our deterrence and defense, which will be lasting and most likely will then include also a significant increase of the size of the presence of the NATO multinational forces in the eastern part of the alliance, including in Poland.
Okay, we'll go to Chas from Ukraine. Gentleman.
Okay, we've been watching NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg. They're ahead of NATO's big summit tomorrow. He was outlining the alliance's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and setting up that summit, which will include the U.S. President Joe Biden in Brussels. And he said NATO members will redouble their support for Ukraine, but that NATO membership for Ukraine is not on the agenda. Let's bring in our NATO correspondent, Terry Schultz, who's listening into the press conference for us there in Brussels at NATO headquarters. Terry, tell us what you took away as the main points here.
Well, certainly everything that Secretary-General Stoltenberg has announced just reminds us how Russia has failed in its demands for NATO to refrain or to reverse decisions that it has taken in past years. Everything that Stoltenberg is talking about is reinforcement of the eastern flank. They are going to double the number of battle groups that were already deployed to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. They're now going to move down the eastern flank to Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia. So you now have 8 battle groups posted there, creating what NATO hopes is a seamless deterrent effect along the eastern flank. He also mentioned more support for Ukraine. And you can tell from his comments here just how high the concern is that Russia is indeed planning a chemical attack. They've seen these false flag narratives popping up for some time. This has been something that has been warned about for some time. But President Biden spoke about this also before leaving Washington. And while NATO, of course, is very worried that this will spread to NATO territory, they're also going to provide more capabilities for Ukraine to battle these kind of attacks themselves: chemical, biological, nuclear, radiological. We don't know exactly what kind of support that will be, but the Secretary General mentioned this several times. So once again, NATO is building up along the eastern flank, and Stoltenberg said several times this is now going to be what NATO's future looks like. He has called this the new normal. Russia's the instability created by Russia's attack on Ukraine is going to last for a long time, and some of these troop reinforcements, some of these equipment reinforcements, he said, are going to be long-term now.
Terry, he was asked a few times by several reporters there about possible red lines that could pull NATO out of its defensive posture. And he made very clear that NATO does not want to enter into a direct engagement here with Russia. I mean, tell us more about what he said on that front.
Yes, NATO does not want to enter into anything that could create a direct conflict with Russia. They don't even want to talk about red lines. They don't even want to use that term, Sumi. What they're talking about is possible scenarios. This is the term that they prefer because, of course, once you set a red line, then you need to act if it's crossed. And that doesn't have a good history in world affairs. So they're very much shying away from using that term. But again, as we've discussed before, I just hear nothing from NATO officials on or off the record, nor from allied officials, nor from allied governments, that they are willing to create this no-fly zone that Ukraine continues to call for, that there's any possibility whatsoever of NATO troops on the ground, of forces coming from any of the NATO allies, even individually. So this is something that Ukraine will continue to call for. And as Stoltenberg said, these are very painful decisions that NATO has to make. But I certainly don't see any sign that it is going to change its collective mind on this.
Terry, last question to sum it up as we look ahead to that big summit tomorrow. What do you think the most important points will be to watch out for in that meeting?
NATO's key task overall is to show that European allies, Europe and the United States are on the same page, and that they are going to create even higher costs for Moscow if it continues its war on Ukraine. Of course, sanctions are only taken on the other side of town at the European Union, where Biden will also visit. But the most important point here is for Russia to know that it cannot cross into NATO territory, not one step into NATO territory. And this is what will be the point of announcing more troops for NATO's eastern allies, and in fact even more reinforcement for Ukraine, albeit not troops. Stoltenberg said he expects more equipment to be sent to Ukraine. This is all an effort to see that the war does not spill into NATO territory, and that will be the core task here at NATO. And then President Biden will move to the other side of town and talk more to European allies about how to increase the price that Moscow is paying for continuing this war on Ukraine.
Terry Schultz for us at NATO headquarters there in Brussels. Thank you very much. Ukraine is calling on Russia to allow civilians to escape the southern port of Mariupol. The local council says Russian forces who have surrounded the city have reduced it to ashes with constant bombing. President Volodymyr Zelensky says 100,000 civilians are trapped without food, water, or medication. Zelensky says Russian forces seized a humanitarian convoy attempting to bring relief to Mariupol's besieged residents.
Bombs keep falling on Mariupol. The besieged city is under relentless shelling by Russian forces. Satellite pictures show the extent of the devastation. Apartment buildings burnt out. A metal factory shelled. Hundreds of thousands of people are